Hi everyone, it's been a while, but I am back today with a new and improved version of my eye tutorial. I decided this time to include a voiceover because hopefully I think I should be able to explain my process a little bit better. So I'll just briefly go over the different types of eye styles that I draw. For the most part, I like to keep it quite simplified. There are a lot of elements of the eye I probably do not draw, such as the waterline, the tear duct, and that's just a stylistic choice, and depending on how realistic I want to go is how I'll decide whether or not I want to include those. So here you can see I have included the tear duct. Again, you can't really see much of the waterline, and it is quite a very simplified eye. And this one here is just a cartoon style eye. There are no defining elements except for that we have the eyeball, the lids, and the eyelashes, and that's pretty much it. So for the purpose of today's tutorial, I will do a somewhat more detailed eye. I will try and add those elements in that you would see if you were looking at an eye reference. It's not necessarily the way I'll do it every time, but if I were to do a more realistic portrait, I would draw an eye more in this stylized version. So I'm going to start with just the default brushes. So I use the 6B pencil quite a lot, and it's one of my favorite brushes to use for sketching. So I obviously start with the circular eyeball shape, and I begin to add in the upper eyelid, and the crease of the eyelid. I've decided upon the direction that the eye is looking, and there's the tear duct and the crease under the eye. So I keep my first sketch just very, very simple, very basic. I'm not going to start adding details at this point. I just want to make sure I have the shape right. Add the pupil and highlight direction too. So I've duplicated that layer so that I can start onto the next stage. So I've set that layer to a lower opacity so that I can draw on top with my new layer. So here is where I'll define the sketch with a little bit more detail, and so there's a little bit cleaner for when I go into the colour stage. I still keep it quite loose and quite sketchy because I don't really have a clean line art style of art, so this is just the way I prefer to do it. I'm also just adding in some basic shading, which will help me at the colour stage too. I decided to record this real time just so you can see the choices that I make during the sketch. Now, normally if I weren't recording this, I would be quicker and I wouldn't be as precise. I just feel like it's more beneficial just to see the general direction that I go in. Even though I might not draw in this style every single time to this level of depth and detail, this is still the same process I would do if I was drawing any picture. So I've duplicated that layer again. And I put a layer underneath so that I can color on that layer underneath, and the sketch itself I have set to the multiply layer so that I can still see the sketch underneath the color. So I'm just picking a peach color. The color that I choose for the eye itself is a gray color. Don't go full white, because then no eyeball is pure white, and then your highlights will not pop as more when you do eventually add them. Also adding in some warm shadows for the crease and the skin. You'll notice that I'm using quite a few different colours, so I've used a somewhat peach tone, reddish tones, yellows, and then blue for the highlights, and I think it's nice to have that variation in skin tones so that you have the warmth of the shadows, but then the coldness of a highlight. I feel like it makes a picture just pop a little more. So you can see here I'm adding some highlights. This is still the rough stage. I'm being very careful with how much white I add to the eye, but still maintaining that spherical shape by keeping the shadows around, let's say, the edges of the ball, if you were to look at it. So I've grouped those layers together so that I can move them together easily, and duplicated for my next step. I like to change the sketch layer to a different color because I don't like having to paint on top of black, because my sketch should be a more neutral tone. When I'm happy, I flatten the layer so I can start painting directly on top. So at this point I am simply just rendering the drawing, and I just pick and choose from the canvas since I've already laid down the colours that I want to use. Which is why I think it's important to do that step properly at the beginning so that you don't have to try and select new colours when you're at the rendering stage. So I constantly flip between changing the size of my brush and also the opacity of the brush, because it's easier to blend if you lower the opacity and you won't have hard edges. The brush I'm using is not a default brush. I will link it below in the description. It's one of the gouache brushes from Max Packs. So this is the most time-consuming part of the drawing, even though the majority of the work is actually done. So the sketch is done, the colour is laid down, and it is just putting that all together. So I've added a waterline. So I like to darken the crease so it's more obvious. And I'm darkening the lash line. I don't like to add too many eyelashes, that's just a stylistic choice. So I'm just adding a highlight there to the bottom of the eye above the waterline. Here's where I'm adding texture just to make it look more skin-like. And now I am just reinforcing where those highlights are. So you can see how those highlights really pop when you use white against using the grey for the actual eyeball itself. Also adding some highlights to the tear duct. Just adding in a few details into the iris. So this is the stage where I start just adding in those little details that make the eyes stand out a little more. So just sharpening up some lines, adding a few eyelashes, adding a little more texture. So I've duplicated this layer and I will make some final adjustments. So I'm using the curve adjustments to work with the contrast. And I'm also going to use the color balance layer, which you can use for the shadows, midtones and highlights, and push them in a direction of a color. So you can see I'm just playing around with the sliders to see what colors that I like, and I will do that for the shadows, the midtones and the highlights. That combined with using the curves for the contrast, I feel like really enhances the colors and the depth. So that's just a simple breakdown of how I draw eyes, probably a little bit more detailed than how I'd usually do an eye in my drawings at the moment. I'm trying to keep things more stylized rather than realistic, but if I were to draw something slightly more realistic, this is probably how I would do it. I hope this has been helpful. Leave a comment if you found it helpful and if there are any other tutorials that you would like to see. Hopefully I'll be producing some Procreate tutorials soon. A lot of people have asked about them on my Instagram. So I'm going to do bite-sized type tutorials, useful workflows that I have, things about layers, how I pick colors, how I use colors, brushes that I have, all those kind of things. So let me know what kind of tutorials you'd like for those too. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video.